Hello, and welcome to the planet's memory, a quiet place where we drift slowly through time and let the Earth speak in its oldest voices. Here, curiosity isn't hurried. Here, science wanders like a river, soft, wide, and slow. Tonight, we begin with a question, one that rests at the edge of reason, at the bottom of oceans, and somewhere deep in the sediment of our imaginations. What if we're not the first to dream of cities? Not the first to build, not the first to fall, not the first to ask who we are or to be forgotten for asking. And as you settle in tonight, wherever you are, whether the ocean is far away or gently breathing outside your window, I invite you to wonder with me. If you find comfort in these quiet journeys, please like or share this moment with someone who might need stillness too. Nothing here will be rushed. Nothing will chase you. We'll simply drift. So let's begin not with history, but with absence. Because the story of Earth is not one of continuity. It is one of erasure, of floods that don't just drown, but wash away centuries, of volcanic winters that bury not just forests, but memories, of continents that crack like plates and drift until even their ghosts forget where they began. And somewhere in that churn, that quiet, endless planetary forgetting, there's room for a question. Could there have been others? Not mythical gods or giants, not aliens or angels, but species of Earth, like us, or maybe nothing like us at all. Could they have built something? A settlement, a city, a language, something that lived and moved and wondered, and then didn't, not because of a war, not because of a comet, but because that's what entropy does. You see, Earth is old. Not old like ruins or pyramids or legends. Old like silence. Old like pressure. Old like the kind of time that doesn't remember anything unless it's written in stone or frozen in bone. Our written records, all of them, go back maybe 5,000 years. Our tools, a few million. But the planet is 4.5 billion years old. That's not a gap. That's a canyon. A canyon wide enough to swallow whole civilizations. Not just once, but over and over. Maybe not. But the possibility is worth holding gently, like a fossil in your palm. Because civilizations, if they came before us, wouldn't be made of plastic and carbon and satellites. They might have used materials we can't detect anymore. Or lived in climates now lost beneath glaciers or deserts or seas. And the Earth, with all its beauty, is not a reliable archive. The oceans recycle their own floors every 200 million years. Continents collide and crumble and vanish into subduction zones. Even mountains erode, grain by grain, until nothing remains but a whisper in the wind. The past is not permanent. It is borrowed. It is breath on glass. So if there was a civilization, even a small one, even once, what would be left? Not much. A strange layer of carbon in sediment. Pattern in isotope decay. A soot line in an ice core. Tiny signs. Barely signs at all. But then, how would we know? What if the ruins we're searching for were never stone, but biological? What if their footprint wasn't a building, but a bloom of strange metals, or a shift in the atmosphere that we now misread as volcanic? Is it possible that Earth's deep time holds other chapters? That we're not the first to wake up beneath stars and wonder what they mean? That we're not the first to ask, what happens after us? Maybe these others, if they were real, didn't fall in fire. Maybe they faded like shadows in a longer dusk. Maybe their last story wasn't carved in monument or map, but in something softer. A language lost to decay. A tool made of wood, left to rot. A city built on a coastline now 2 miles below the sea. And what if memory itself can't survive the weight of time? What if intelligence rises like heat and disappears just as invisibly? Not because it failed, but because the world changes, and change forgets. There's something humbling about that, something gentle and aching and quiet, because if we are not the first, then we are part of something longer than we can see, a brief glimmer in a cycle of emergence and erasure. And if we are the first, then we are fragile beyond belief, balanced on the smallest ledge of time. Either way, the question remains, what if this isn't our beginning, but only our turn. And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? And so we drift further into the trembling crust of memory, because the earth forgets not only through time, but through movement. The continents are not still. They do not anchor us. They wander, slowly, slower than breath, slower than thought, but always. Their drift is so gentle we mistake it for stillness. But over millions of years, stillness is only an illusion. The ground beneath you tonight, whether it's forest, sand, pavement, or grass, has traveled. It has slid like a dream changing shape, like a page turning so slowly no one notices, until the story is gone. We call it plate tectonics, a language of fault lines and rifts, of collisions and separations. But beneath the terms, it is something stranger. The earth is alive with shifting skin. These plates, vast, stony rafts floating on the soft mantle below, crash, curl, crack, subduct. They lift mountains like whispers. They drown coastlines like sighs. And every motion is both creation and burial. What is built on the surface does not last long, not in geological time. Cities are temporary guests. Mountains are brief monuments. And entire continents, they split apart like memory in a dream. We know that 200 million years ago all land was one. Pangea, a supercontinent, a single massive cradle of life and possibility. And then, not with violence but with persistence, it began to drift. One piece sliding here, another there. India sailing north to collide with Asia. Africa rolling slowly like a tide toward the European plate. Imagine what could have been built on that shared land. Imagine what could have stood there, long before us, washed away not by war or fire, but by movement. Is it possible that tectonics didn't just erase cities, but reburied their entire context? That the very idea of what once existed has been shuffled beyond recognition? Think of a library with all its books torn apart and scattered between continents. What if a city once stood where the Atlantic now breathes? What if a civilization grew where a subduction zone now swallows rock, dragging its artifacts slowly into magma and silence? You see, plate tectonics is not a passive process. It is erosive. It grinds. It buries. Transforms. It folds memory into stone and then melts even the stone. Under the Himalayas lie traces of ancient seafloor. Beneath the Andes, old volcanic arcs swallowed by newer ridges. We find fossils in cliffs that once lay beneath warm lagoons. We find fish in deserts, shells in the mountains, coal in the Arctic. The surface rearranges, and with it so do the clues. If there was once a civilization, before the continents parted, before our maps made sense, its remnants might now be torn in half. Half drifting beneath a jungle, half hidden beneath a frozen shelf. Maybe they left no trace at all. Or maybe the trace is there, but scattered too widely for us to ever notice. Pottery shard here, an unusual mineral layer there, an anomalous isotope that doesn't quite belong. We call these things outliers. We assume they are noise. But what if they are the remnants of something older than erosion, older than weathering, older even than the continents as we know them? And what would it mean to find such a thing? A buried monument, crushed between plates. A lost metallurgy scattered in geochemical drift. A memory moved too far from its origin to make sense again. Maybe civilization doesn't end in fire. Maybe it ends in separation, in disassembly, in tectonic forgetting. And so the ground keeps moving, creaks, it bends, it folds. It opens its jaws and swallows its own past. Not in malice, not in haste, but in rhythm, in the slow, quiet rhythm of a planet that was never meant to remember. And if the earth forgets like this, so softly, so completely, what else might be buried not in time, but in the drift of stone? The continents keep shifting, and still the earth forgets in silence. But not all memories are erased. Some settle deep, pressed into the bones of mountains, folded into the crust like forgotten letters beneath ash. Because there is a language older than writing, a language older than words, the language of stone. It doesn't speak quickly, it doesn't shout, It waits. And when we finally learn how to listen, it tells us what time has hidden. You see, rocks are not just debris. They are archives. Each grain, each layer, each crystal cooled in the dark is a page. Not of events, but of moments, of conditions, of transformation. A record of when something was born, or buried, or changed. And the ink in these pages? Isotopes. Uranium, trapped inside zircon. Argon, sealed inside volcanic glass. Carbon, breathed once by a leaf, a creature, a flame. They decay. They change. They whisper the age of things. But only if we know how to listen. We call this radiometric dating. But the process is more like listening to a lullaby from 1 billion years ago. It's not just chemistry, it's memory. Stone memory. And this memory doesn't care about empires or kings or myth. It cares about heat and pressure and time so vast it barely fits in the human mind. We know, for example, that the oldest rocks we found are over 4 billion years old. Tiny crystals born just after the planet cooled. We hold them in our hands, these glittering flecks, and realize they are older than the moon as we see it now. Older than oceans. Older than life. And yet, they say nothing loudly. Just a presence. Just a silence that stretches back before even bacteria breathed. But not all stones speak of beginnings. Some carry stories of change. Of when something was burned, or frozen, or struck. A lava flow cools and locks in argon. A meteor strikes and resets the isotopic clock. A bone turns to stone, and the carbon within begins to fade, one atom at a time. And so we read the earth not by sight, but by ratios. Ratios of what was to what is. Ratios of decay. Because decay, as soft and final as it sounds, is also the keeper of truth. It's how we know the age of a fossil. It's how we trace the moment a volcano erupted. It's how we uncover extinction events, marked by sudden shifts in carbon or spikes of iridium dust. Even the age of our own species, our branching from ancestral lines, was measured in the ticking of isotopic clocks. And yet, for all that we can know, what can't we know? What stories dissolved before they could crystallize? What bones rotted too quickly? What fires burned too hot? What memories passed through conditions that do not preserve? Because stone only remembers under the right pressure, the right shelter, the right slowness. If something or someone lived in the wrong place at the wrong time, on land later ground down by glaciers, or buried beneath oceans that recycle their floors, then there may be no page to read, no isotope to trace, no memory left, just a blank where something should be. And the earth has many blanks, gaps in strata, missing layers, chapters torn out by erosion, by subduction, by heat. What if a city once stood during such a gap? What if it thrived, then vanished, and the rock that could have remembered it was never formed, or was melted back into silence? We think of stone as permanence, but it is not immune to forgetting. It forgets slowly, but it forgets. And yet, even that forgetting speaks. Even absence has a shape. Even a silence has an outline. Geologists learn to read not just what is present, but what is missing. A missing isotope, a sudden boundary, a change too sharp to be natural. We see these things in the record, the great unconformities, the carbon shifts, the anomalous layers. And every time we ask, what happened here? Why does the earth pause in this place? What was it trying to say before it changed again? Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Because stone doesn't give answers. Only clues. Only rhythm. It's a slow rhythm. A long rhythm. One that does not need us to hear it, but waits all the same. And so we listen, gently, patiently, to rocks that speak in years, in pressures, in decay. Because even if the earth forgets, it does not forget everything. And if we follow this rhythm, if we keep learning to listen, then perhaps we might finally hear something that no one else has heard. And yet, if stones can hold so much memory, what might be hidden in the soot between their layers? Because not everything that remains is ancient. Not every fossil is made of bone. Some are made of intention and accident and things that were never meant to last, but do. Imagine for a moment we vanish. Quietly. No drama. No apocalypse. Just a stilling of motion. And the earth begins its slow work. What would be left of us in 100 million years? Not our language. Not our screens. Not the fleeting sparks of electricity that carried our thoughts. Those go first. Those go fast. But plastic? That lingers. Rebar in concrete? That rusts slowly. Our cities, great luminous hives of glass and metal, would collapse into heaps, but not into nothing. Their skeletons would endure, pressed into layers of dirt, shifted by landslides, drowned by rising seas, frozen, then buried again. Until, centuries later, they fossilize. Not into natural forms, but into something stranger. Technofossils. The imprint of us not in biology, but in technology. Geologists of the far future, whoever they are, may find this strange stratum. A line of artificial polymers. A sedimentary spike of rare earth elements. Microchips turned to crystal, composites never seen in nature. It would look different from the layers above and the layers below. Like a scar. Like a sudden pulse of strangeness. And they would wonder what lived here. What made these materials? And why did it vanish? Maybe they'd call it the plastic horizon. Maybe they'd see it as a singularity, a point in time where the earth was briefly touched by something complex. Maybe they wouldn't understand it at all, because our materials are not humble. They are engineered, pressed, layered, extruded. But they are also fragile in ways we rarely admit. Our data lives on drives that decay faster than memory. Our monuments crumble when no one maintains them. Our great digital libraries dissolve faster than clay tablets. And so, ironically, our most lasting legacy may not be our knowledge, but our trash. Plastic beads embedded in shale. Soot fused with alloy fragments. Concrete laced with radioactive traces from atomic tests. These are not the things we meant to leave behind. They are not poetry. They are not art. But they endure. And endurance is its own kind of language. So now turn that lens backward. If we, a species just 300,000 years old, have already seeded the earth with technofossils, could it be that another civilization did the same, long before us? We look into ancient strata, into layers pressed tight by time, and we ask, is that coal seam just organic decay? Or something else? Is that spike in metals volcanic? Or the byproduct of machines? Most times, the answer is natural. Most times, the anomaly is explained. But every now and then, we find something that doesn't quite fit. An object out of place. A mineral with an unusual structure. A formation that looks engineered, but might not be. And we wonder, not because we have proof, but because we can feel how narrow our evidence truly is. How much we might be missing. Because technofossils do not shout. They do not glow. They wait, compressed, obscured, sometimes changed beyond recognition by heat, by pressure, by time. What if their version of plastic decomposed long ago? What if their cities weren't made of steel, but of something biodegradable? What if their machines used chemistry we no longer recognize? Or worse, what if they existed in a window of time we've never thought to examine? Between rock layers too old for archaeology but too young for geology to question. There is a middle ground, an unlabeled gap between human memory and planetary time. It's in that gap where mystery sleeps, where technofossils from another age might already lie, unnoticed. So we dig and we catalog and we measure isotopes looking for patterns. But patterns can be subtle, and some traces can only be read by minds shaped differently from our own. Maybe we're not missing the evidence. Maybe we're missing the right question. Because if we vanish and leave behind only artifacts without context, how will they know what we meant? How will they know what we feared, or loved, or dreamt of becoming? And maybe that's the real heart of it. Fossils are not just remains. They are misunderstandings waiting to happen. And technofossils might be the loneliest kind of all. Not because they aren't real, but because they are so easily misread. Like a sentence written in a language we forgot how to speak. And if that's what we're leaving behind, if that's what lasts of us, then what might have lasted of someone else? That question settles like dust, and we follow it into the soft, unhurried violence of time. Because not everything is lost in fire or collapse. Some things disappear slowly, quietly, not with a scream but with a sigh. Not in a single night, but over eons of rain. Erosion, the planet's softest hand, and yet its most persistent. Rain falls, wind whispers, roots reach through cracks. And what was once a structure, a wall, a temple, a city, becomes sand again, becomes dust again, becomes nothing more than sediment waiting to be carried downstream. Erosion doesn't ask permission. It doesn't care what we've built. It doesn't remember that something was once sacred. It simply continues. Mountains crumble not in avalanches, but in pebbles. Statues do not shatter, they melt under a million droplets of patient water. And oceans, with their long and reaching fingers, climb higher. They eat coastlines grain by grain, until even the outline of memory vanishes. We like to think that what we make can last. But time does not honor our intentions. A single monsoon season can wash away a village. A few thousand years of rainfall can flatten a palace. A million years of wind can erase a continent's edge. So, what have we lost already? Not stories written down, those go fast. But entire landscapes, entire maps, gone. Not beneath catastrophe, but beneath the calm, relentless forgetting of erosion. And if we know that mountains fall, if we see for ourselves the ruins buried in floodplains, the cities swallowed by desert dunes, the petroglyphs softened until they are indistinguishable from rock itself, then we must ask, how much more has vanished that we never even knew was there? Could it be that a civilization, one before ours or beside ours, built with hands and minds like ours, but in materials less stubborn, in climates less kind, was undone not by war or collapse, but by the weather? Not overnight, but gradually. Maybe they built in wood. Maybe they carved in clay. Maybe their knowledge was stored in something delicate, woven, spoken, painted with dyes that bleed in rain. And erosion, with its breath of wind and water, took it all, piece by piece, layer by layer, until all that remained was stone. But not the carved kind, just the kind that forgets. We've seen it even in our own records, whole cities swallowed beneath shifting sands. Entire cultures erased by floods, preserved only when the earth made a rare mistake and sealed them in ash or ice or desert stillness. But what about the ones it didn't seal? What about the ones it simply let go? The kind that never fossilized, the kind that dissolved. Not because they weren't real, but because they weren't lucky. We have no catalog for the forgotten, no list of what erosion has erased. Just hints, just absences, just stories that stop suddenly, as if the page was torn out by rain. And isn't that the most haunting part? That a civilization could rise, dream, build, love, reach toward stars or gods or silence, and be undone by nothing more than weather. Not because they were weak, not because they were wrong, but because they were part of the earth, and the earth forgets naturally. It doesn't keep what it doesn't need. It doesn't preserve without accident. It doesn't notice when something disappears, only when something resists. And most things don't resist. Most things blur. Most things fade. Most things are carried downhill, washed to sea, dissolved in rainfall so fine we never felt it happen. And so we look at a hillside and we see only dirt. But maybe once it held a settlement. Maybe once it held a voice. We stand in a valley and we see only trees. But maybe once there were roads. Maybe once there were songs sung into the wind, songs no longer caught by any ear, no longer echoed by any stone. And if the earth can forget so gently, so completely, then perhaps we must ask not just what's beneath us, but what used to be on top. What stood here before the rain? Before the winds rearranged the hills? Before the rivers braided and broke and ran away with stories? We'll never know for sure, but we can wonder. And wondering is sometimes the closest we come to remembering what was never ours to know. Because erosion may take what we build, but it cannot take our questions. Not yet. And if weather can wear down even the hardest stone, what might it have done to things we never thought to look for? That's the trouble with history. It's easy to follow the loud parts, the meteor strikes, the lava flows, the extinction events etched like scars across the fossil record. They roar. They leave behind soot and shattered layers, sharp lines in the rock that say, something ended here. But between those lines, between the ice and the fire, there is quiet. Long, drifting stretches of calm. Tens of millions of years, sometimes more, where nothing dramatic happened, or so we think. These are the silences, the spaces between catastrophes. And perhaps they are not empty. Perhaps they are simply overlooked. Because mass extinctions, as violent as they are, leave us markers. But the subtle moments, the slow centuries, the periods of gentle climate, of geologic stillness, they leave us nothing but quiet sediment. Layer upon layer of sameness, of continuity, of peace. But peace is where life has room to grow. And what grows can change, can rise, can build. Could it be that in one of these long intervals, between the great dying of one age and the seeding of the next, a civilization emerged? Quietly, briefly, and then, just as quietly, it faded? Not with a bang, but with a hush. No flood, no fire, just time. Just the natural arc of things rising, thriving, and falling, too softly to leave a mark. We have names for the loud moments, the Permian extinction, the Chicxulub impact, the flood basalts of Siberia. But what do we call the ages between them? The warm, wet millions of years when the earth was kind? We don't call them much. We skim past them, because they don't catch the eye. They don't scream. They don't fossilize drama. And yet, those are the windows. Those are the forgotten chapters. Time enough for rivers to shape valleys, for forests to rise and fall, for species to emerge, to learn, to make and unmake. Imagine a people who lived not in crisis but in balance, who shaped the earth gently, who left behind no towers of steel, no scars of combustion, no sharp chemical signature in the strata. Would we ever know they had been here? Would the silence between epochs speak their name? Or would they be washed into the long hush of deep time, their presence folded into the soil, their absence mistaken for never? Because we do not just lose memory in extinction. We lose it in continuity. We lose it when nothing interrupts the rhythm. The longer the peace, the deeper the forgetting. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most likely place for lost civilizations to hide. Not in the chaos, but in the calm. We look for signs in the drama, the spike in iridium, the sudden disappearance of species, the ash trapped in ice. But what if the greatest stories are hidden where nothing shouts? Where the sediment is fine, undisturbed, quiet as sleep? What if someone lived there, in that unbroken span between extinction and emergence, and left behind only questions? A trace of carbon misread as forest fire. A symmetrical structure mistaken for geology. A layer too uniform to draw attention, and therefore never truly seen. It's easy to believe in catastrophe. Harder to believe in soft disappearance. But the earth is not always cruel. Sometimes it's simply forgetful. And when it forgets slowly, it forgets completely. And so we wonder, not just about what we've lost, but when we've lost it. Not just about who came before, but when they might have passed through the long, unspeaking dark. Between the ice and the fire. Between the extinctions. Between the known and the assumed. In the soft, unmarked middle, where silence is not proof of absence, but the echo of something once tender. And if peace erases gently, how many lives have passed through time without ever touching the rock? And if silence is not the absence of history, but its softest disguise, then we must wander further, into a time before even silence had shape. Long before bones. Long before shells. Before trees, before fungi, before even the whisper of animal breath. There was something else. A world alien in composition but native to itself. A planet wrapped in methane. Its sky tinted not blue, but orange. The seas were dark then, rich with iron, heavy with potential. A vast biochemical experiment, quietly brewing complexity beneath a sun not yet kind. And into this world came oxygen, not as a gift, but as a catastrophe. It came not from fire or comet but from life itself. Tiny photosynthetic microbes, pulsing in the shallow coasts, breathing out a gas they didn't know would change everything. At first, it dissolved into the oceans, oxidizing iron into rust. It fell out of the water like blood into silt, layer by red-stained layer. But eventually the oceans filled, and oxygen had nowhere else to go but up, into the sky, into the breathless atmosphere. And with that, the Earth transformed. The great oxygenation event. Turning point. A mass extinction, not of creatures as we know them, but of chemistries, of metabolisms, of entire invisible kingdoms whose bodies could not tolerate this new, corrosive air. We call it a beginning because oxygen made possible the rise of complex life. It let us happen. But something else had to end for that to be true. And so we ask, what was lost? What was there before the oxygen came? Could there have been systems of life that thrived without it? Not just microbes, but something more coordinated, more intelligent, more curious? We assume complexity belongs to our kind, or at least to our era. But what if intelligence once wore a different mask? What if it emerged in a chemical world we can no longer imagine, let alone detect? Because oxygen doesn't just enable life. It also breaks things down. It rusts metal. It burns carbon. It accelerates decay. It's not just a giver. It's an eraser. So if something delicate once lived in that ancient anoxic world, if it thought, if it built, if it dreamed beneath methane skies, then oxygen may have swept it away not just biologically but chemically. Its body, oxidized. Its traces, combusted. Its artifacts, transformed into materials unrecognizable to us. Even its memory, if it had one, would have dissolved in the great oxidizing tide. We wouldn't find ruins. We wouldn't find bones. We wouldn't even find tools because their chemistry wouldn't belong to the oxygen world that followed. We'd find only a gap, a mysterious red band in the rocks, signaling the presence of oxygen. But not what it erased. The banded iron formations, layered rust laid down across the planet, are all that remain of the moment oxygen arrived. Not of what came before. Those bands are like curtains, drawn slowly over a story already in motion. We're left wondering what the first act was. Who or what was performing before the stage changed forever? Could it be that we are not the first complexity, but merely the first to survive the oxygen curtain? The first to find safety in the gas that once killed everything else. We might be inheritors, not pioneers. Children of a world that already had its moment and lost it. Not to war, not to a fall, but to a shift in air. And perhaps that's the most humbling idea yet. That memory itself can oxidize. That knowledge, unprotected, can turn to dust in a new atmosphere. That entire chapters of existence can vanish not because they weren't real, but because they were written in a chemistry we no longer speak. And if even the sky can erase the past, what other transformations might we mistake for beginnings, when they are really endings? To live on Earth is to live within time, but not the time of clocks, not the hours that pass as we wait for sleep to come. No, there is another kind of time here, a deeper one, older than breath, slower than thought. We call it deep time, not because it's distant, but because it's thick, layered, weighty, folded in on itself so many times that even memory loses direction. It's easy to think of the past as a straight path, a road we can walk backward, step by step, until we find the beginning. But in truth, the past is a labyrinth. And deep time is the dark at its center. There is nothing empty about it. The further we go, the more we find pressure, silence, density. Not absence, but compression. And what lives in compression is not always visible. Because not everything is fossilized. Not everything becomes stone. Not everything leaves behind a bone to cradle in sediment. The truth is, most things vanish cleanly. Most lives pass through the world without ever touching the rock. Soft-bodied creatures melt into silt. Wood decays unless conditions are perfect. Skin, hair, cloth, thought, they all dissolve into the soil long before the next layer forms. Even our own record as modern humans is full of absences. There are whole cultures we only know by the shadows they left. A broken pot, a burial site, a pigment smeared on a cave wall, half erased by breath. And that's within the last 10,000 years. The blink of a geological eye. But deep time? It stretches billions. And within those billions, what might have vanished without ripple or stain? What might have passed through the earth like wind, real, alive, but gone without mark? We tend to believe that the past is visible because we find pieces of it. But we find those pieces only because they survived impossible odds. A bone must fall in the right place. It must be buried quickly. It must mineralize. It must endure pressure, water, heat, and then, miraculously, be uncovered at just the right moment by someone who knows what to look for. Most bones don't make it. Most stories don't either. So we wonder, what kinds of things would vanish cleanly? Not just because they were soft, but because they were subtle. Maybe they lived in forests that are now coal seams. Maybe they settled along rivers that migrated away, leaving no trace but altered mud. Maybe their tools were biodegradable. Maybe they shaped the land in ways that look natural to us now. Maybe their presence blended perfectly with the flows of wind and rain and dust. And deep time, with its slow currents and buried loops, would swallow that presence without hesitation. No scandal, no catastrophe, just forgetting. And even the forgetting becomes layered, compressed beneath new oceans, folded into new mountain ranges, melted into new magma, until even the trace of erasure is erased. We drill into ancient rock and call it empty. But emptiness is not the same as absence. Sometimes what's missing is exactly what was once most alive. A moment of culture, a glimmer of coordination, a brief civilization that didn't leave behind monuments but patterns. And patterns are hard to fossilize. We might not recognize them. We might be walking on them, because deep time doesn't just bury. Transforms. It bends. Presses. It turns cities into sand, shelters into seams, language into silence. And the deeper we go, the fewer questions we remember how to ask. There is no map for this. No trail marked by bones. Only shadow. Only layers of earth so dense, so still, that they hum with everything they no longer show. We listen. We dig. We measure isotopes and catalog anomalies. But deep time keeps its secrets. Not cruelly, just naturally. Because when memory is buried for that long, it doesn't resist. It doesn't echo. It simply becomes part of the stone. And maybe that's the final form of history. Not a record. Not a warning. But a blending. A dissolving. So when we ask, what kinds of things leave no trace? Perhaps the answer is, most of them. And the further back we go, the more true that becomes. So if we wish to understand what came before, we must look not just for what's present, but for what's missing. For the silences too wide. For the stones too undisturbed. For the patterns that repeat without reason. Because deep time does not forget loudly. It forgets by folding everything into itself, until only the shadow of possibility remains. And if deep time casts such long shadows, what might still be sleeping inside them? That's the paradox of the past. We imagine it solid, made of bones, of ruins, of things we can hold. But most of it isn't solid at all. Most of it never was. Because fossils, as we know them, are not the rule. They're the exception. Not every creature becomes a fossil. Not every moment becomes a memory. In fact, almost nothing does. The fossil record, that sacred text of ancient life, is full of holes. Not gaps between pages, but gaps between entire chapters. Entire epics, never written down. Fossils form only under the rarest conditions. A body must fall in just the right place. Not too wet, not too dry. It must be buried quickly, protected from scavengers, from rot, from the hungry breath of oxygen. And then, slowly, the minerals seep in. Atom by atom, bone becomes stone. The living becomes the remembered. But what about everything else? What about the animals that died in open air under sun and wind and time? What about the plants that withered in forests now lost to erosion? What about the people, if there were people, who built in wood and cloth and firelight and whose bones were never buried at all? What about them? They vanish. Not because they mattered less, but because chemistry forgot them. And geology never knew they were there. A million bones never hardened. A million tools never preserved. 1,000 cities washed away by rivers that now flow somewhere else. We tend to believe in the past we can see. But the past we can't see is larger, wider, deeper. It's full of unpreserved lives. Soft-bodied creatures whose names we'll never learn. Stoneless cultures who left no carvings. Nomadic people whose entire existence floated on air and silence. And it's not just about biology. Even today we see it happen. Entire buildings crumble in decades when left to weather. Paths vanish in forests in less than a generation. Plastic can last for centuries. But paper, fabric, skin, they dissolve. They are already dissolving. So we ask, what if the fossil record is less a history and more a lucky glimpse? What if we're seeing only what chance allowed to survive? And what if entire civilizations rose and fell and left nothing but sediments that look no different from the rest? We've built cities on floodplains. They wash away. We've built temples on cliffs. They collapse. We've built homes in jungles. They are taken back by vines, by moss, by time. Now stretch that process across 10,000 years. Now stretch it across 1,000,000. Even concrete returns to dust, given enough pressure, enough water, enough silence. And bone, our most trusted record, can be ground down by nothing more than the passage of feet, the settling of dirt, the trembling of land. So when we look into the earth and see no fossil, no ruin, no tool, can we truly say nothing was there? Or must we admit that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence, but simply the quiet luck of geology? Maybe there was a village where now there is only clay. Maybe there was a body where now there is only iron. Maybe there was a story where now there is only the wind. Fossils are not the past. They are the residue, the remains of what refused to be erased. But erasure is natural. Erasure is constant. And most things, most beings, most thoughts, most entire civilizations, go gently, unfossilized, unremembered, undisturbed, not because they weren't worthy, but because they were soft, because they were made of breath and intention, because they belonged to a time that didn't write in stone. And so we walk through this world surrounded by things that are gone, not beneath us, not hidden, just missing. And maybe the greatest mystery is not what we've found, but what we never will. Because the earth doesn't tell us everything, only what it happened to keep. And if fossils are a fluke of timing and chemistry, how many truths have vanished without ever becoming stone? And if so much is lost in the failing of bones, the soft collapse of cities, the quiet forgetting of erosion, then what remains? Dust, ubiquitous, unnoticed, underfoot. It gathers on windowsills, clings to corners, floats in a beam of late afternoon light. But dust is not empty. It is the end of things. Ground down, worn thin, shattered too finely to name. We treat it like nothing. Sweep it, ignore it, shake it from our clothes and forget it came from something whole. But what if some dust is more than decay? What if some dust is memory? Not in the poetic sense, but in the literal. The final residue of intelligence. Not all civilizations leave behind temples. Not all tools fossilize. Not all stories are carved. But everything in time breaks down. And when it breaks down far enough, when it crumbles past recognition, what's left may be a single layer of grainy silt. A powder blended with clay. A trace folded into the chemistry of soil. Not enough to raise a flag. Not enough to prove a presence. But perhaps enough to suggest one. Imagine a world long before ours. Its people, whoever they were, built not in steel but in things more natural. Structures of fiber. Machines of mineral and air. Thoughts encoded not in silicon, but in structures we no longer understand. And when they vanished gently, slowly, those materials didn't endure. They weren't fossilized. They weren't preserved. They became dust, carried on winds, swept into cracks, washed into basins. And we, millions of years later, walk on that dust, grow food in it, crush it beneath our tires, never knowing what it once was. We study soil horizons, layers of earth that stretch back in time. We look for carbon, for pollen, for rare minerals. Sometimes we find soot, sometimes we find ash, and sometimes we find nothing we can explain. A strange signature, an element slightly out of place, too faint to call a mystery, too present to ignore, so we file it away. An anomaly, a chemical blip, nothing more. But what if those blips are whispers? What if the dust is saying something we no longer know how to hear? Could a civilization leave behind no ruins, but a fingerprint in the dust? Could memory itself be so finely ground that it blends with earth until it is inseparable from it? There are layers in the soil we call technosols, soils altered by human activity. You can find traces of plastic, of metal, of combustion. We are already seeding the future with dust of our own. We don't think of it as legacy, but it is. And if we disappear, this dust will remain. Future scientists of whatever kind might kneel beside a riverbank and brush away a few centimeters of sand, only to find a darkened layer rich in synthetic compounds, with ratios that don't occur in nature. They'll wonder, what burned here? What lived? What ended? And perhaps they'll never know, because not all dust can be decoded. Not every particle carries a story that can be reconstructed. Sometimes the details are too small, the information too degraded, just like a page torn into pieces, then burned, then scattered. Even if we gather the ash, we can't read the words again. But the ash is real, proves something was written, and maybe that's all we ever get. Not the story, but the faint trace of its telling. So we dig, and we test, and we think we know where intelligence begins, when we see bones shaped like ours, when we see fire, when we see tools. But what if intelligence isn't always visible? What if it leaves no monument? What if its last remains are not stone, but dust? Dust we cannot decode. Perhaps we are surrounded by it. Perhaps it falls with the rain, collects in the corners of caves, settles in layers too fine for our machines to classify. Perhaps it speaks not in symbols, but in silence. And if that's true, if intelligence can end in dust, what else might we be mistaking for dirt? The more we search for the past, the more we realize it doesn't simply disappear. It changes, softens, rearranges itself until it looks like something else entirely. And at the heart of that quiet transformation is a force older than planets, quieter than time, and more relentless than memory. Entropy, not a villain, not destruction, but something gentler, something slower, something that simply prefers disorder to order, because that's the way of the universe. Entropy does not scream. It whispers. It does not erase. It rearranges. A city becomes rubble. Rubble becomes dust. Dust becomes silt. Silt becomes stone. And stone forgets. Entropy doesn't rush. It has forever. And forever is long enough to take anything and make it look like nothing. It is not chaos. It's just the soft fade of organization into randomness. The way a perfectly folded cloth eventually crumples. The way heat leaves a cup. The way stories lose their edges when no one tells them. And so we look into the earth for signs. We look for the sharp edges of intention, for the lines that mean this was made. But entropy is an expert archivist. It files everything under eventually. Eventually the walls fall. Eventually the books rot. Eventually the signals degrade and the memories scatter. Not violently, just naturally. You could say entropy is the true archaeologist. Patient, indifferent, systematic in its own quiet way. We like to imagine that our ruins are safe. That somewhere, a deep vault of stone or ice or silence will protect our knowledge. But entropy visits everything. It seeps into metals. It softens polymers. It breaks down language not just in paper but in minds. Even the things we think of as permanent, Our monuments, our archives, our digital footprints are all written on surfaces that entropy is already reading. Reading and rewriting. It doesn't need to understand. It doesn't need to want. It simply acts. Heat flows outward. Energy disperses. Patterns unravel. And so the past doesn't stay where we put it. It drifts. It warps. It merges with what surrounds it until the original shape is gone. Could that be why so much history feels like it's missing? Not because it's hidden, but because it's become something else. Folded back into nature. Its edges blurred beyond recognition. What if entire civilizations, if they came before, were not destroyed but gently unspooled? Their cities softened into hills. Their tools broken into minerals. Their stories scattered into soil chemistry. Entropy would not rush this. It would take its time, millennia or more. And by the time we arrived, our own civilization just beginning to notice the deep past. The past itself had already been lovingly disassembled. Because that's what entropy does. It doesn't erase on purpose. It doesn't hide with malice. It simply nudges everything toward randomness. So perhaps it's not that we're looking in the wrong place. Perhaps we're just looking for the wrong shape. We expect clarity, sharp outlines, obvious symbols. But the remnants of lost time may not be symbols anymore. They may be heat left in stone, a bias in mineral distribution, a softness in rock where once there was intention. And if the universe tends toward disorder, then memory must always be fighting a losing battle. But still, some things persist. A fossil in just the right layer. A tool in the right kind of soil. A carved stone shielded from wind and rain. Not because they were strong, but because they were lucky. And luck, for all its randomness, is sometimes what history depends on. So when we wonder why the past is silent, why no great signal from a lost civilization has reached us, why the rocks do not shout with forgotten names, maybe it's not because no one was there. Maybe it's because entropy got there first. The great unwinder, the quiet editor, the eternal archaeologist, not cataloging things with intention, but still ensuring that everything ends up somewhere, just not where it began. So we sift through strata hoping to catch the outline of what was. But perhaps all we will ever find are the shadows, the scattered, randomized residue of what once had order. And perhaps that's all we can expect. Not certainty, not proof, just patterns, just hints, just the slowed decay of something that once meant something. And if entropy is this patient, if it can turn even monuments into whispers, how many civilizations might have passed through the hands of time without ever leaving a name? It's tempting to believe the things we build are permanent, that a monument means memory, that a skyscraper, rising into the clouds, can hold its place in history just by reaching high enough. But permanence is a feeling, not a fact. And even our tallest towers have a clock beneath them, because every structure, every word, every culture has a half-life. Not a sudden ending, but a soft, predictable fading. The term comes from physics, the time it takes for half a substance to decay, to lose its shape, to change into something else. But memory has one too. Not in atoms, but in meanings, in relevance, in presence. And so we ask, what is the half-life of civilization? Not just its people, but its memory, the signal, its outline. How long before even the brightest chapter dims into background noise? Let's start with what we leave behind. Take a skyscraper. Steel, glass, concrete, engineered to endure. But take away maintenance, take away people, power, protection, and the countdown begins. Glass shatters. Water seeps into cracks. Rust blooms like ivy. Concrete flakes. Within a few decades, the windows are gone. Within a century, trees root in the elevator shafts. By the 1,000-year mark, the building has buckled, swallowed by its own silence. 10,000 years, and what remains is indistinguishable from a cliffside ruin. A strange rock formation out of place but not impossible. Give it 1,000,000 years and even that erodes. Not all at once, but slowly, layer by layer, its story is translated into the language of stone. And stone, as we've seen, does not speak clearly. Now think about language. This half-life is shorter still. The average spoken tongue survives only a few thousand years before it shifts, fractures, or vanishes. Already, most of the world's oldest languages are silent. Even written records degrade. Clay tablets crumble. Books decay. Digital media becomes unreadable when the devices that read them become extinct. Ideas last longer only if they are retold. Only if someone remembers to remember them. But that too fades. Every civilization thinks its ideas will echo. That philosophy will outlive fire. That ethics and meaning will endure because they feel important now. But importance is not the same as permanence. Even memory, the most intimate form of history, has a half-life. After 3 generations, most family stories vanish. After 5, even the names fade. We might pass down genes, but stories fall apart like paper in rain. So if memory itself decays, if no structure, no word, no monument is immune, what can we ever truly preserve? Perhaps nothing. Or perhaps only patterns. Maybe what survives isn't the content, but the echo. Not the city, but the idea of a city. Not the story, but the rhythm of telling. Not the monument, but the instinct to build one. Civilizations might not pass down what they made, but how they made. How they imagined. How they wondered. Even then, entropy waits. Half-lives upon half-lives. Signal fading into noise. And so we return to the earth after we're gone. Our cities crumble. Our satellites fall. Our archives collapse inward like tired lungs. And what remains, eventually, is dust. Dust we cannot decode. Stone that once had shape. Anomalies we mistake for nature. And maybe that's what happened before. Maybe another civilization reached its height, watched its stories rise with pride, then slowly, inevitably, slipped beneath its own half-life. Now all that's left is a layer, a chemical shift, a buried heat trace. Not enough to name, not enough to know, just enough to wonder. Because even when memory decays, the question doesn't. The question remains. Soft, persistent, curled into the silence like roots in old stone. And if every memory fades in time, what kinds of remembrance are we already standing on, unaware they were ever meant to be remembered at all? We often imagine ourselves at the beginning of something, a fresh species, a new chapter, a clean slate on a clean planet. We picture early Earth as untouched, raw, a world waiting for us to arrive. But what if that was never true? What if the Earth we inherited was already cluttered with ghosts? Not spirits in the mythical sense, but leftovers, impressions, unnoticed residues of something else that came before. We build on foundations all the time. A city atop ruins, a road layered over ancient trails, a temple absorbing the stones of a temple before it. It's a rhythm so familiar we don't always see it happening. We inherit. We overlay. We forget. So why would we assume that our planet's past is any different? Why do we speak of the dawn of life as if nothing stirred before it? Why do we imagine the origin of civilization as if the land hadn't already been marked softly by something else? The Earth is not a book that starts at page 1. It is more like a palimpsest, a manuscript rewritten again and again, each new script faintly layered over the last. The deeper we go, the more smudges we find. Mineral oddities, buried anomalies, unexplained isotopic shifts. But even as we uncover these fragments, we tend to assume we are the first authors. That ours is the first real story. That before us, there was nothing but rock and silence. But maybe the rock is not silent. Maybe it's just full of stories that no longer have their own language. Maybe we didn't start with a blank canvas. Maybe we started on top of someone else's painting. And time, like an inattentive archivist, pressed one layer over another until the lines blurred, until the boundaries between chapters could no longer be seen. We say Earth is 4.5 billion years old, as if age alone makes it ancient. But age also makes it busy, dense, crowded with the debris of eons. Even before animals, before plants, before bones, this planet was already churning with life. Microbial, yes, but life. Endlessly creative. Unimaginably old. And who are we to say that nothing more complex ever emerged and simply disappeared before complexity learned to fossilize itself? Perhaps there were rises and falls before the Cambrian explosion, hidden so well we mistake the absence of bones for the absence of minds. Perhaps what we now call natural was once designed, or shaped, or used, not in ways we would recognize, not with our tools, but with other intentions, other rhythms. We speak of nature as if it is innocent, but what if it is inherited? What if rivers flow in paths first etched by other hands? What if soil remembers patterns pressed into it by feet that no longer walk? Not everything ancient has to look artificial to be meaningful. Not every ghost has to wear a face. And so the myth of the clean slate, the idea that we began with nothing beneath us, starts to falter. The earth may not be waiting to be written on. It may already be full. And if we are building our cities on top of a past we do not see, then we are not pioneers. We are inheritors. And perhaps, unknowingly, we are repeating what was already tried, already tested, already lost. So before we declare this moment as the beginning, we might pause and ask, how many beginnings came before us, forgotten not because they failed, but because we stopped looking for their fingerprints? And if we are not the first to walk this world, how much of what we call natural is really just what remains? And if we accept that the earth is not a clean slate, if we let go of the idea that nothing came before us, then we must begin to wonder what kinds of things might have risen and left no bones behind. Because bones fossilize, shells endure, but minds do not fossilize. Not often, not cleanly, not in the way we wish they would. A brain is soft. It decays fast. Even in the rarest conditions, it vanishes before the rock has time to close around it. And ideas, they're even more fragile, lighter than ash. They pass between breath and word, between gesture and silence. They live in memory, and memory lives in things that do not last. So we're left with a strange question. Could consciousness, not as we know it now but as a phenomenon, have come and gone before we ever carved meaning into stone? Not once, but many times. Could thinking, wondering, feeling have emerged in bodies that no longer exist, or in forms we would not even recognize as bodies? What if intelligence is not rare, but impermanent? Not a peak but a pattern, a rhythm that rises and recedes like a tide, like breath, a kind of planetary exhalation, awareness rising for a while then sinking back into matter. What would that look like from our distance in time? Not like cities, not like tools, not like anything we know to search for. It might leave behind a subtle anomaly in the carbon cycle, or a strange layer in the deep sea floor, or nothing at all but a shape, a feeling in the arrangement of stone. A pattern that isn't quite natural, but not quite artificial either. A suggestion, a hunch, an echo that doesn't belong. We want evidence to be sharp, clear, obvious. But what if the only evidence that ever existed was the mind itself, and all the rest was just its passing breath? What if they, whoever they were, left no buildings because they didn't need them? What if they changed their world in ways that could never fossilize? What if they built their lives out of light or sound or thought? What if they passed through this world like dreams, real in their moment, but gone without trace the moment they ended? We measure ancient life by its residue, but consciousness may leave no residue. It may live and die entirely within the unfossilized. And this should not surprise us. Even today, how much of what we value, what defines us, can be preserved? Not our memories, not our moods, not our imagination. You can hold a book, but not the feeling of reading it. You can find a painting, but not the quiet it brought to the one who made it. If all of us disappeared tomorrow, what would remain of our inner lives? The mind is an event, not a thing, and events vanish. So perhaps, when we look to the past and find only silence, we should not assume nothing happened. Perhaps something happened so interior, so soft, so complete unto itself that the earth let it pass without writing it down. Just as dreams dissolve when we wake, perhaps whole eras of thought dissolved into the soil, into the stone, into the wind. And maybe, when we walk along a cliffside, or brush our hand across ancient rock, there is something there. Not visible, not measurable, but felt. Not a message, but a presence. A trace of attention. A place where consciousness once stood quietly, then walked on. And we, minds built from newer clay, pause for a moment not knowing why. Feeling only that something about the land feels familiar. Not in shape but in awareness. And that is the unfossilized mind. Gone, but not erased. Absent, but not meaningless. We cannot carbon date a thought. We cannot dig up a dream. But that doesn't mean they weren't here. And if minds can rise and fall without leaving anything behind, how many awakenings might the earth have already forgotten? Some things leave no trace. Others leave only one. A single mark. A darkened layer. A smear of black along the pages of the planet. Soot. Tiny particles. Light as breath. Lifted into the sky by flame. Carried by wind. And finally, laid to rest. Pressed into ice. Settled into sediment. Trapped in time. There are places, deep in the glaciers, where the layers tell stories. Season by season, year by year. Pale bands of snowfall. Traces of pollen. Dust from deserts half a world away. And then a sudden line of black. Thin but unmistakable. A signature. A fire. And not just one. Across the world's ice caps and ancient lake beds, scientists find soot layered into time itself. Dark bands, resting between cleaner snows. The fingerprints of burning. Some local, some global. And always the same question. What burned? And who, if anyone, set it alight? Some soot can be explained. Volcanoes. Lightning-sparked forest fires. Natural heat in a dry world. But other layers are harder to place. Too large. Too frequent. Too fine. Almost as if something sustained the burning. Fed it. Stoked it. And here, in this thin, dark line, the imagination stirs. Because what if those fires weren't entirely natural? What if, long before our own industries, another spark had already caught? Not myth. Not magic. Just a species, thinking, experimenting, transforming its world with fire. What if there were chimneys before ours? Furnaces whose ashes have long since cooled, but whose soot still drifts in forgotten snow. It wouldn't take much. Not skyscrapers. Not satellites. Just enough combustion over enough time to whisper into the atmosphere and leave a residue. A breath of industry reduced to carbon. We've done it ourselves. In just a few short centuries, we've laid down our own soot trails, clear, measurable layers in ice and sediment. Proof of our flame-fed hunger. And if we vanish, that soot will remain. A black line, waiting in the glacier, to speak of a time when the air was full of burning. So if our layer is real, undeniable, fossilized, why not others? Why not earlier ones, just faint enough to doubt? Some say these dark bands are simply the mark of lightning, of natural fire sweeping ancient forests. And maybe they are. Maybe that's all. But maybe not. Maybe there were hands behind the heat. Voices behind the smoke. A people, a process now vanished except for this. A whisper of soot pressed into the cold. The earth doesn't care what caused the fire. It only records that something burned. And that's what makes soot so strange. It is evidence without context. Truth without explanation. A trace that proves something happened but not why. So we wonder, could this soot be a story? Not just a chemical footprint, but the last breath of an earlier moment of intelligence. Not a message, not a monument, just the smoke left behind after a long-forgotten kindling. And if so, then the past may not be as quiet as we think. It may be smoldering still, under glaciers, under sediments. Inside the core of coal seems where ancient fire was folded into rock. Because soot does not speak, but it does endure. And in that endurance, there is something sacred. A thin black line that might be the only sentence that remains. And if fire was once used not just to warm but to shape, then what stories might be written in the ash we've yet to understand? Fire leaves soot. But deeper than soot, quieter than ash, there are other traces. Smaller, finer, harder to erase. Isotopes. Atoms that wobble. atoms that decay, atoms that linger long after the hand that made them has turned to dust. They hide in layers of sediment, in the slow curl of stalactites, in ice drawn tight over ages. They do not glow, they do not sing, but they stay, and they carry whispers of heat, of pressure, of process. We read them like runes, not with eyes but with instruments, machines that can measure the tiniest difference between what was expected and what arrived. Carbon-14 used to date what was once alive. Lead-210, settling like soft dust into lake beds. Plutonium-239, a stranger, unnatural, uninvited, born from nuclear fire. These are not fossils. They are fingerprints, not of biology but of behavior, of action, of change. Because while bones tell us who lived, isotopes tell us what happened, what burned, what broke, what released energy too focused to be natural. And this is where the wondering deepens. Because in the strata of the world, layered gently by wind and water and time, we sometimes find things that don't quite fit. Isotope ratios that lean in unusual directions. Traces of elements that shouldn't be there. Small pulses of something unnatural from a time when natural was all there should have been. Tiny anomalies small enough to doubt, but not small enough to ignore. What if, somewhere in the deep past, someone else reached this point? Not us, not human, but curious, capable. A people who learned to change their world not just with stone or fire, but with atoms, with precision. Could they have left their mark in isotopes? Not intentionally, not as a message, but as a side effect, the quiet trail of their own transformations, their own fuel, their own undoing. We've done it. Our nuclear age is etched into the planet. A sudden spike of carbon and lead and cesium in sediments across the globe. A layer so clear some have proposed it as the marker for a new epoch, the Anthropocene. If we vanished tomorrow, this radioactive echo would outlast us. Plutonium, with a half-life of 24,000 years, would still be present when mountains have changed shape. Uranium, settling in patterns that speak not of volcanoes but of machines. Could another layer like this exist? Beneath our feet, buried under ice, compressed beneath sandstone. So old that we no longer recognize it as a signal. So old that we mistake it for natural variance. Maybe they didn't build cities. Maybe they didn't leave ruins. But maybe they split atoms. Maybe they refined. Maybe they released energy that left its shadow in the atomic fabric of the Earth. And maybe we've already found it. Maybe those strange isotope ratios in core samples, those odd concentrations in ancient lake beds, are not errors, not noise, but echoes. Echoes in the isotopes. We wouldn't know what to look for. Our instruments are only as good as the questions we remember how to ask. And if their technology was different from ours, cleaner, subtler, based on principles we've yet to rediscover, then the echoes might be quieter still. A flicker in the thorium count, a lean in the neodymium, a shimmer of artificiality lost in the drift of data. It's not proof, but it's enough to wonder. And wondering is its own kind of listening. Because the Earth does not lie, but it doesn't volunteer answers either. We must ask with care, with patience, with the humility to know that we might not be the first to touch the atom. And if someone came before and vanished, then what remains may be nothing more than a few quiet signatures deep in the strata, telling no story at all unless we learn how to read it. Because if they burned their world like we are burning ours, if they split the same particles, unwound the same equations, made the same choices, then the clues are there. Not in ruins, not in tools, but in atoms, in isotopes, in echoes. And if the Earth has recorded these quietest traces, what other names might be hidden in the periodic language of its dust? If the Earth holds echoes in its atoms, if it remembers in isotopes, in soot, in silence, then maybe the patterns we find aren't just anomalies. Maybe they're repetitions. Because what if civilization is not a miracle, not a once-only bloom in the long garden of time, but a rhythm, a cycle, rising, falling, rising again? The Silurian Hypothesis. Not a theory of a single lost civilization but of many. of intelligence returning again and again like a wave, not in the same form, not in the same species, but with the same impulse, to shape, to build, to understand, to reach beyond the simple rhythms of survival. We think of ourselves as new, as unprecedented, but maybe we are only the latest in a long sequence of forgetting and remembering. Civilization not as a line but as a spiral, each loop rising, collapsing, and vanishing into the sediment before the next begins. We look at the fossil record and see long silences. We look at the archaeological record and see gaps. We assume those are empty spaces. But what if they are simply buried stories, told in materials that don't last, or hidden in patterns we haven't learned to recognize? Maybe the rise of intelligence isn't rare. Maybe it's inevitable, a function of time, of biology, of curiosity unfurling like a fern every few million years. And with each emergence, the same temptations: fire, tools, cities, signal, decay. And each time entropy waits, the same gravity that pulls structures downward, the same wind that wipes words from stone, the same rain that returns empires to mud. It wouldn't take much, a subtle shift in climate, a cascade of ecological collapse, or maybe just time, slow and patient, reclaiming what was briefly held. And then silence, not the silence of failure, but the silence of intermission, of the earth resetting its stage. And the next act begins with no memory of the last, because memory too has a half-life, and after a few thousand years it becomes myth. After a few million it becomes nothing. We are conditioned to see ourselves as exceptional, the first to build satellites, the first to harness fission, the first to alter the atmosphere on a planetary scale. But what if we're not the first? What if we are only the first to do it with plastic and concrete instead of other materials now long lost? What if others reach this height in different eras, under different skies, with different bodies, different ways of thinking, but the same deep questions about what lies beyond the horizon? We might never find them, or rather, we might have already found them but not understood what we were looking at. A black layer in the ice, a spike in rare isotopes, a pattern in sediment that doesn't quite belong. Civilization leaves marks, but only if it lasts long enough, and only if its tools become part of the rock. And even then, time will soften it, smooth it, fold it beneath the crust, so the record of those who came before may not be gone. It may simply be blurred, like footsteps on a shoreline after the tide comes in. Faint, but not erased. The Silurian Hypothesis doesn't claim certainty. It only opens the door to possibility. It says, maybe we are not the only ones to have wondered where we came from. Maybe we are not the only ones to have searched for our own beginnings and found only dust. And maybe this is not the first time a species looked at the stars and imagined being remembered long after it was gone. Perhaps even now we are closer to the next forgetting than we know. And when it happens, if it happens, there will be silence again. A pause, a resetting of the clock. And in some future epoch, something else will emerge. Eyes opening, minds unfolding, hands reaching, and they will ask the same questions. Who came before us? Were we the first? Is there anyone out there in the past waiting to be found? And maybe they will find us. Or maybe not. Maybe we, too, will leave only subtle fingerprints. The faint outline of a cycle almost but not quite forgotten. And if civilization is a rhythm, a pulse that returns again and again, how many beats might still be buried between the ones we know? And if civilization is a rhythm, rising, falling, returning, then maybe not all memory needs to be written. Maybe not all remembering belongs to us. What if the earth, in its quiet, patient way, remembers for itself? Not in words, not in stories carved on stone or etched into code, but in form, in flow. In the deep language of landscape, a river curves through a valley and we think erosion, sediment, gravity, time. But what if it's more than that? What if the river is tracing the path of something lost? Not just carving stone, but echoing a pattern first laid down by other hands or other forces long ago. What if mountains remember pressure? What if fault lines remember tension? What if the canyons remember something being pulled apart? not just geologically but intentionally. We do this ourselves. We build canals that become rivers. We reshape hills for farming. We alter coastlines with harbors and seawalls. And if we disappeared, if our names faded, if our buildings crumbled, the shapes would remain. A terrace in a hillside, a sudden bend in a flat plain, a strange symmetry in a desert. And those shapes, those scars, those patterns would become the land. Future eyes might mistake them for natural. Future minds might never guess they were left behind by intelligence. And perhaps the same has already happened. Perhaps the earth holds memories not as relics, but as outlines. Not as objects, but as arrangements. A pattern in the ridges of a canyon that suggests more than water. A strange radial structure in the forest that resembles the layout of a long-lost city. A hill, too perfectly conical, rising from a plain with no volcanic past. We tend to explain these things as coincidence, as erosion, as accident. And often they are, but not always. Sometimes what we call natural is simply too old to remember otherwise. The earth is not static, but it is shaped. And every shaping is a kind of memory. A glacier moves across a continent and leaves valleys that still bear its weight. A river shifts over centuries and carves a story into stone. Even the wind, with its gentle insistence, writes lines in cliffs that last for ages. So if intelligence once stirred here, not ours but another, and if that intelligence shaped its surroundings with enough time, enough repetition, enough presence, then maybe the earth absorbed that shape. Like skin holding a scar long after the wound has healed. Maybe we're walking through memory all the time and don't recognize it as memory. Not because it's hidden, but because it doesn't speak our language. It speaks in watersheds, in fault lines, in the strange geometry of coastlines that don't quite match the randomness we expect. And we, distracted by bones and tools, forget to look for meaning in the map itself. We look for civilization in objects. But what if some civilizations left no objects behind? What if their legacy was the terrain? A valley cut too evenly, a plateau too level, a stone plain arranged just enough to feel intentional. We call these things natural wonders. But maybe they're echoes. Maybe they're memories of forgotten design. Even now we terraform. We rearrange. We leave fingerprints in the very elevation of things. And if we vanished, our roads would crumble. Our cities would rot. But the way the rivers were redirected, the pattern of the soil, the changes in water flow, in light, in shadow, those would last. They would become part of the land. And maybe that's the real archive. Not carved into tablets, but folded into the terrain. Not stored in vaults, but whispered by valleys and repeated by ridgelines. And so, we must ask, is the earth trying to remember? Not consciously, not deliberately, but through form, through motion, through the slow retention of everything it has ever touched. Maybe the planet forgets only when it's forced to, when erosion wipes the slate, when fire cleanses, when subduction pulls everything beneath the crust. But until then, it remembers, in shape, in silence, in the landscape itself. And if memory can be held that way, through contour and curve, through depth and rise, then what ancient stories are still being told in the way the land quietly folds itself beneath our feet? Some landscapes whisper, others are sealed, encased, preserved not in stone, but in stillness. Antarctica, we think of it as timeless, a white silence stretching into forever, a land of frost and wind, of emptiness and cold. But under that cold, beneath nearly 2 miles of ice, the ground is not as still as it seems. There are rivers down there, lakes warm with pressure, canyons and mountains buried beneath a frozen ocean of air and time. It is not flat. It is not simple. It is not lifeless. And this makes us wonder, was it always this way? Because the ice is not eternal. The Antarctica we know was not always frozen. Once, long ago, it was green. It held forests. It breathed seasons. Felt the sun. Ferns grew where now only snow falls. Trees rooted where glaciers now grind. And beneath it all, rock, land, soil that once knew warmth. The continent has drifted. It has tilted. It has turned. Through cycles of climate, through shifts in Earth's long memory, Antarctica has frozen and thawed again and again. We know this from pollen, from coal seams, from the fossils of plants and creatures found hundreds of meters beneath the ice. So what else might be buried there? If warmth once graced this continent, even fleetingly, could something have lived? Could something have flourished? We think of Antarctica as remote, but during certain ancient eras it was not. It was connected to Australia, to South America, to the rest of Gondwana, a supercontinent that held space for life to roam. And if people, or something like people, existed in those far-forgotten times, could they have reached it? Could they have settled its coasts, its valleys, its rivers now lost beneath the ice? We assume not. We assume there was no one. That intelligence had not yet emerged. But we've been wrong before. We've discovered footprints older than our maps allow. Tools deeper in time than expected. Hints of knowledge where only instinct was thought to live. And now we face a continent that has swallowed its own history. Buried beneath 9 trillion tons of ice is a world we've only just begun to scan. With radar, we trace hidden mountain ranges. We find subglacial lakes, still liquid, untouched for millions of years. Lake Vostok, Lake Whillans, others unnamed, sealed in darkness, in silence, in time. We drill, we sample, we wonder, we find microbes still alive. Not fossils but breath, not memory but persistence. And it begs the question, if microbial life can endure beneath this crushing cold, what else could have? Could a civilization have existed in a warmer window before the ice returned? Could it have thrived in the mild twilight between global shifts? And when the cold came back, as it always does, did it bury not just forests but cities? Not just rivers but roads? We don't know, because Antarctica keeps its secrets better than any place on Earth. It locks its past beneath layers that take millennia to form. It folds history into permafrost and pressure and holds it there, motionless, while the rest of the world forgets. We are only beginning to look, only beginning to ask. We search with satellites, with seismic pulses, with drilling rigs and cautious hands. But the ice is vast, and time is deep. What lies below may never be fully known. But possibility lingers. And sometimes that's enough. Because if there was warmth once, there could have been life. And if there was life, there could have been thought. And if there was thought, then somewhere beneath the glacial weight, there might be the buried breath of a people who stood where now only wind dares travel. Their voices gone, their tools dissolved, their structures pressed flat by the patient exhale of the ice. And all that remains is shape, arrangement, absence. We do not know what we are walking over, or what we are failing to see because it has been crushed too perfectly. But we keep searching, because even here, in this quietest of places, there may still be memory, sealed in frost, held in stillness, waiting for the thaw. And if an entire world can be buried in silence, how many more might lie beneath the cold forgetting we call ice? And when the ice began to melt, when the long freeze loosened its grip on the earth, the forgetting didn't stop. It only changed its rhythm. Because water remembers in motion, but it also erases in silence. At the end of the last ice age, roughly 14,000 years ago, the world began to rise from its cold sleep. Not suddenly, not all at once, but in pulses. Waves of meltwater, rushing from retreating glaciers, swelled the oceans. First slowly, then violently. In geologic terms, it was a blink, a meltwater pulse, a rapid surge in global sea level that drowned coastlines and swallowed islands that had once been homes to forests, animals, and maybe people. We know the ocean rose more than 120 meters. We know entire landmasses disappeared. We know that what is now seafloor was once shoreline, once valley, once visible. So we ask, what was there before the water came? Because if civilization existed, even a simple one, it would have lived by the sea. We always have. Water gives life. It feeds, connects. The earliest known settlements in every part of the world sit close to ancient shorelines. But the shorelines we know now are not the ones our ancestors knew. They are new, recent, redrawn by the breath of a warming world. Which means that whatever stood along the old coasts, whatever was built before the oceans rose, is now underwater. And not just shallowly, not just beneath beach sand, but beneath hundreds of feet of salt water, mud, and time, sunken not in catastrophe, but in patience. And that is its own kind of disappearance, because erosion on land is slow, but underwater, structures soften faster, wood dissolves, stone wears smooth, context vanishes, and when we search we find only hints. Stone circles off the coast of India, submerged ruins near Yonaguni, Japan, traces of ancient paths beneath the waters of the North Sea. In a place once called Doggerland, they could be natural, they could be illusion, they could be memory. We don't know, because the sea is hard to question. Its answers come clouded in silt. Its history is buried beneath tides and pressure and the slow rearranging of sand. But we ask anyway, could someone have lived there, along those vanished shores before the sea rose to claim them? Could a culture have grown in the warmth of a post-glacial springtime, only to vanish beneath the ocean's quiet returning? They would have had time, thousands of years, enough to shape, to settle, to wonder. And when the meltwater pulse came, when the ice collapsed into rivers and the rivers into oceans, they may have watched their world shrink. Not in myth, not in metaphor, but in daily tides that never receded. And maybe they left, or maybe they didn't, or maybe they left only questions. Because stories have their own way of surviving the flood. We find them in every culture, echoes of a great deluge. A flood that came, that swallowed, that changed everything. In Mesopotamia, in India, in the Americas, in the highlands and the islands and the places once closer to the sea. Each tale is different, but the water always comes. The world is always reshaped. We call them myths, but what if they are memories? Stretched, yes, woven into symbol, but rooted in something real. A shoreline that vanished. A village taken by the tide. A story passed from mouth to mouth until it became a warning. A song. A legend. And so we listen, not just to the rock, not just to the isotope, but to the sea itself, its shape, its layers, its silences, because somewhere beneath the sediment and salt, there may still be walls, steps, fire pits, fragments, proof not of grandeur, but of presence. That someone stood where now there is only water, and looked out at a horizon that no longer exists. And if the sea could speak, not in waves, but in stories, how many names might it whisper from the world it gently drowned? We often imagine prehistory as a void, a hushed wilderness, a long, uneventful pause before the noise of civilization began. We fill it with wind, with stone, with wandering animals, but rarely with voices, rarely with ideas, rarely with the hum of thought. But what if we're wrong? What if the earth, long before our first known records, was already alive with memory? Not the kind carved into monuments, not the kind saved in vaults, but lived memory, spoken, traded, sung beside fires, not forgotten because it was small, but because time, slow and unbending, erases softly, and softly is all it needs. We assume silence means nothing happened, but silence is also what remains when everything fragile has faded. No clay tablet survives the floodplain forever. No woven story lasts once the reeds dissolve. And no language spoken aloud, no matter how rich, how sacred, how real, can survive 1,000 years without a body to carry it. So what if the world before history wasn't silent, but simply biodegradable? A place of living cities woven into forests, vanished without smoke or ruin. A place where technology existed but not ours. Not silicon and steel, but natural, ephemeral, designed to vanish as gracefully as it appeared. We think of intelligence as synonymous with permanence. That to be advanced is to leave behind stone or synthetic scars. But maybe the truest intelligence knows how to live without lasting. And if such civilizations once thrived, if they rose in cycles we've long since forgotten, then their memory would be unmarked. Erased not by disaster, but by design, or by neglect, or simply by time doing what time does best. A few centuries of erosion, a few millennia of dust, and a world full of meaning becomes a bare hillside that no one thinks to question. So when we call the deep past empty, we're speaking from the limits of what we can hold, not the limits of what may have been. We carry with us a kind of bias that what matters must be visible, that what's lost was never important. But stories don't agree with that, and neither does soil, because every now and then we find an anomaly, a tool too old, a burial too complex, a painting in a cave that shouldn't have known how to see like that. And we explain them, or try to, or file them away for later. But maybe, just maybe, they are the surviving breath of something larger. A civilization that hummed beneath our feet for thousands of years, never asking to be remembered, never needing to be loud. And perhaps their greatest invention was learning how to vanish without leaving ruin. So when we walk through a valley, or climb a hill, or wade across a riverbed and feel a strange familiarity, as if the place knows something we don't, maybe that's not imagination. Maybe that's memory, not ours, the Earth's, not clear, not spoken, but layered into its skin like a dream that almost wakes. And if prehistory was not silence, but a soft chorus long since faded, what harmonies might still be echoing in the parts of the world that have forgotten how to speak? Sometimes memory doesn't come as story, or shape, or artifact. Sometimes it arrives as shadow, a trace, a residue pressed into silence so thin, it could be missed entirely. And yet, there it is, in the fine grains of ancient clay, where time has settled quietly, we find the faintest of imprints, carbon. Not the carbon of life alone, but something stranger, something more deliberate, something that doesn't quite fit the usual rhythm of decay. Blackened flecks, thin chemical fingerprints, a layer of soot where no fire should have burned. We find it buried deep, under layers of sediment, under thresholds of time where humans weren't supposed to be, where no cities should have existed. And yet the signal persists. Carbon signatures, sometimes microscopic, sometimes diffused through entire strata, tell us that something once burned. Not a wildfire, not a volcano, but something different. A concentration of heat too controlled to be natural, too sustained to be random. What was it? We don't know, but the questions bloom like smoke. Could these be the ashes of long-lost fires, tended by hands now gone? Could these be the shadows of old machines, run on fuels we no longer recognize? Not engines like ours, not combustion as we know it, but something else, still hungry, still hot, still echoing through the clay it touched. You see, carbon doesn't forget easily. It weaves itself into the earth, nestling in the microscopic crevices, bonding with minerals, waiting. And while bones decay, and wood vanishes and memory walks off into wind, carbon stays. It lingers like breath trapped in stone. And so we measure it, we map it, we try to explain it. And sometimes we can't. Sometimes the signature is too old, or too strange, or simply too out of place for any easy answer. And so we're left with a choice. Do we assume it's an error? Anomalous chemistry? Do we file it away with a shrug and move on? Or do we pause just long enough to wonder? Because what if the clay is telling us something we no longer have a word for? What if the earth, in its slow recording, has remembered a time when fire wasn't only a force of nature, but a tool held by someone who lived before story, before fossil, before we had the language to describe what civilization even was. They might not have built empires, but they might have shaped heat, directed it, used it to craft, to cook, to transform. And then they were gone, not in flame but in forgetting, and all they left was the shadow of combustion, folded into mud that would one day become brick, or shale, or a question in the hand of a scientist 10,000 years later. Because carbon isn't loud. It doesn't explain itself. But it is faithful. It stays. And when we find it in places it should not be, in clay older than civilization, in layers untouched by modern fire, we must ask, what burned here, and why? Not all fire is natural. Not all shadows are accidental. Maybe someone long ago lit something for a purpose. And maybe that purpose was just forgotten before it could be understood. Maybe they cooked. Maybe they forged. Maybe they powered something we would not even recognize. Or maybe they simply lived, long enough to leave behind the breath of 1,000 small flames, gathered, used, left to settle into the fine-grained earth. We won't find their names, or their tools, but we might find the carbon shadows of their passing, pressed into clay, fused with memory, too soft to speak, too strange to ignore. And if even the smallest ember can leave a signature, how many invisible fires still glow beneath the surface of our knowing? We've learned to listen for memory not in words, but in layers. Because the earth does not speak in sentences. It speaks in strata. Each layer, pressed gently into place over centuries, over millennia, over unimaginable spans of time, holds a story. Not always clear, not always loud, but there, patient. Sand becomes sandstone. Ash becomes shale. Fossils, dust, soot, pollen. Each embedded in a geologic timeline written without ink. And we, curious and quiet, begin to read. We measure for carbon. We test for metals. We scan for the strange. Because every so often, one of those layers speaks out, not with language but with anomaly. A spike in iridium, pocket of lead, a faint radioactive glow where none should be. And in those moments, we pause. Because sometimes the earth doesn't just remember nature. Sometimes it remembers something more. Something made, something caused, a signal, not like a beacon, not a deliberate message, but a footprint, the shadow of intelligence that passed this way once, and left just enough behind to unsettle the silence. We've seen it in our own time. Our industries have already marked the planet in ways that will echo for millions of years. We've changed the chemistry of the atmosphere. We've left a layer of plastic particles that drift into sediment like artificial pollen. We've created synthetic compounds that will not break down for eons. We've spread metals rare and reactive into soils and oceans and skies. And we've left radioactive isotopes whose half-lives are long enough to outlive memory itself. This, some say, is our signal, our geologic fingerprint, the mark that we were here, that we thought, that we built, that we broke things open. And if we are already leaving such a mark, then we must ask, could someone else have done the same long before us? We drill into sediment cores and find anomalies, spikes in concentration, layers of metallic ash, traces of chemical activity that feel too organized to be purely random. But they are small, scattered, hard to prove, and so they become mysteries, filed away under uncertainty. Not ignored, just unanswered. But the possibility remains. What if intelligence always leaves a signal in the strata? Not a monument, not a structure, but a pattern, a rupture in the normal order of things. What if we can find civilization's footprint in the chemistry of rocks? A sudden change in carbon ratios, a subtle tilt in isotopic balance, a thin film of metals never before seen together in nature. The signal may not tell us who, or why, or how, but it might say someone was here. And if we learn how to read it, if we refine our tools, our questions, our patience, we may begin to distinguish natural variation from intention. We may begin to see not just events, but choices. Because geology holds everything. But it does not organize it for us. It doesn't sort the past into the meaningful and the meaningless. That's our work. To interpret. To notice, to ask. And what we're beginning to see is that civilization might not be loud in its presence, but in its residue. Not in towers or temples, but in the fine dust that settles quietly after the last fire is out. Maybe we are not the only ones to have sparked such a change. Maybe the earth has been marked before, softly, strangely, subtly, by other minds, other hands, other pulses of culture that rose and fell long before we arrived. And if their signal still lingers, not on the surface but deep in the sediment, deep in the stone, then it means we're not just digging through rock. We're digging through memory, through story, through the buried traces of decisions made in other tongues, under other skies. And if intelligence always leaves behind a chemical ghost, what other signals might be waiting to be heard, layered softly beneath our certainty. We like our beginnings to be clear, marked, named, and in the story of life on Earth, one such mark is drawn cleanly across the rock. The Cambrian boundary. Roughly 541 million years ago, something changed. Suddenly, so it seems, life became visible. Shells, teeth, skeletons, fossils that held their shape as time moved on. We call it the Cambrian explosion, a burst of complexity, of form, of biological architecture that could finally endure. And so paleontology begins there, because bones remember, and the Cambrian is when bones began. But what lies beneath that line? What came before the world began to fossilize itself? We know life existed. The Precambrian Earth was not empty. Microbial mats stretched across shallow seas. Single-celled organisms pulsed beneath the water's surface. Stromatolites formed, layer upon layer, marking time in calcium and light. But beyond that, we see less, much less, not because nothing happened, but because soft life leaves almost nothing behind. Below the Cambrian line, the fossil record dims, and then it blurs, and we begin to assume no skeletons, no story, no structure, no civilization. But what if we're mistaking invisibility for absence? What if below that threshold, there were chapters we no longer know how to read? Entire sagas, lived in biology too soft to hold its place in stone. Organisms, maybe even intelligent ones, that rose in those deep and ancient seas, briefly, beautifully, before folding back into silence. We're cautious with these thoughts. Science teaches us to be. But the Earth has always been more complicated than our categories. The lack of fossilized bones doesn't mean nothing walked, or swam, or thought. It only means they didn't leave the kind of bones we know how to find. And in a world before shells, before skeletons hardened into permanence, what kind of life might have flourished and vanished without a trace? Perhaps intelligence doesn't require a skull. Perhaps memory can form in fluid structures we've never imagined. And perhaps civilization, if it ever rose in those strange early waters, was built from things too delicate to endure. We assume civilization must build. But what if it once flowed? What if it shimmered in colonies of thought that moved like currents, and organized like coral, and communicated in pulses no fossil could preserve? We might be standing atop the ruins of a world that left no ruins at all. A world that knew itself but not permanence. That chose to adapt rather than solidify. That dissolved willingly when its time was done. And now, it is gone except for the silence beneath our feet. That silence is thick. The rocks beneath the fossil line are ancient beyond measure. But they're not empty. They're full of folded layers, crushed minerals, chemical patterns that don't quite explain themselves. Some scientists call this the hidden Earth, a time we may never fully unlock. And maybe that's true. Or maybe we haven't learned how to ask the right kind of questions. We search for skeletons. But what if the signal was never meant to last that way? What if the Cambrian explosion was not the start of life's complexity, but the point at which complexity began to fossilize? Everything before that could still have happened. Not in shadow, but in softness. And that softness, pressed under time and heat and weight, may have left a different kind of memory. One we're just beginning to feel. A strange ratio. A whisper of carbon. A structure in the stone that doesn't fit the known biology of its time. Not proof. Not evidence. Just an ache that something is missing. Something important. Something beautiful. Something that once might have looked up from the bottom of a Cambrian sea and wondered what it meant to be remembered. And if the stories of the Precambrian world are buried beneath biology's earliest chapter, what else might be hidden beneath the page we've mistaken for a beginning? We tend to believe that to be remembered, one must leave something behind. A monument, a tablet, a mark on stone, or metal or fire-hardened clay. But what of the ones who chose not to carve? The ones who lived without chisels, without glyphs, without the need to scratch their names into time. Not all civilizations write. Not all need to. Some pass knowledge hand to hand, mind to mind, rooted in voice, ritual, rhythm. A language sung instead of drawn. A history remembered, not recorded. A people whose legacy was not in their architecture, but in how they moved through the world. Lightly, briefly, beautifully, like mist, like the trace of wind on still water. What if they lived in balance with their land, not from lack of ability but from intention? What if they understood that permanence is an illusion, and chose instead to be part of the cycle, not separate from it? We look for ruins, but not all cultures build to last. We search for signs, but some signs are not meant to be seen, only felt. And so we ask, could an entire people vanish without contradiction? Without disaster? Without even a whisper to suggest their end? Yes, because disappearance doesn't always mean destruction. Sometimes it means completion, a season ending, not collapsing, a chapter closing, not torn away. There are places in the world where people once lived, not thousands but tens of thousands of years ago, and now, there is nothing. No rubble, no trace, just the shape of the land so slightly changed that only the patient eye notices its difference. A terrace carved into a hillside, a path through the trees that resists overgrowth, soil that remembers being walked on, even after the feet are long gone. We ask, where did they go? But perhaps they didn't go. Perhaps they faded. Perhaps they returned to what they came from, and left no contradiction because none was needed. No empire falling, no kingdom burning, just the gentle letting go of a life well lived. And the dust holds what remains. Not artifacts, not tools, but traces, minerals disturbed in subtle ways, pollen patterns altered by long-gone farming, microscopic shadows in clay where fires once glowed warm. These are not declarations. They are impressions, unwritten, but not without meaning. We find them now and then and hesitate, because they don't fit the narrative. They suggest life without leaving proof. And so we call them anomalies, or we look past them entirely. But what if these are the stories we most need to hear? What if the people who left no writing knew something we forgot? That to live well is not always to be remembered, but to be present while you are here. To shape the world gently, and let it recover when you are gone. So we keep searching for the loud civilizations, the conquerors, the builders, the scribes. But in the shadows of that search, beneath the layers that never hardened into legacy, there may be others. The whisperers, the listeners, the ones who passed like dust and left only the silence where their stories might have been. And if their absence feels like a mystery, perhaps that is their greatest message. That not everything worth knowing is written down. That not every life must leave a monument. And that sometimes, the most complete civilizations are the ones that leave no contradiction when they are gone. Just harmony, just balance, just dust, settling softly where a people once stood. And if whole worlds can pass this way, unwritten, unburdened, how many have already come and gone, seen only in the quiet they leave behind? To find what's been forgotten, sometimes we have to look where forgetting begins. And often that place is the sea. The ocean does not erase the way fire does. It does not tear like wind, or shatter like quake. It holds, it buries, presses everything downward into stillness. Sediment falls slowly, like snow in a dream, tiny grains, dust, ash, plankton, pollen, drifting from the surface to the deep. And as they fall, they settle, layer upon layer, year after year, until the bottom of the sea becomes a record, a memory pressed into mud. We study it with long cylindrical cores, samples pulled from miles beneath the waves. And there, in the layers, we find stories, soot from ancient fires, isotopic changes from sudden climate swings, shifts in oxygen levels marking mass extinction events. The ocean floor remembers, not clearly, not precisely, but faithfully. And so we wonder, if cities once stood on land that is now drowned, would the ocean remember them too? Not as ruins, but as disturbances, as shifts in the rhythm, as subtle interruptions in the chemistry of the sea. Because sea levels rise. We know this. At the end of the last ice age, oceans surged more than 120 meters, reclaiming coastlines, submerging valleys, remapping the world. Places that were once high ground now lie beneath hundreds of feet of saltwater. Entire land bridges vanished. Islands disappeared. Shorelines retreated, and whatever was built too close to the edge was taken. Not in an instant, but in a long, slow breath. A rising, a swallowing, a soft burial beneath waves that did not retreat. And beneath those waves, beneath the churning shallows, sediment began to fall, covering everything. So if a people lived there, on those drowned plains, those sunken shelves, and if they built something worth remembering, then it may still be there, quietly held in silt under miles of pressure and time. Not intact, not whole, but traceable, in the shape of the seabed, in the mineral content, in the way the layers shift in just one place. We already see strange things on sonar scans. Angular shapes, grids beneath the sediment, ridges that run too straight. Most are explained. Geology, tectonics, illusion. But not all, and not always completely, because the ocean is vast, and exploration is slow. Only a tiny fraction of the seafloor has been mapped in detail. Most of it remains unseen. A dark, pressurized library of forgotten arrangements. We know how long it takes to find something even when we're looking. So imagine what lies undiscovered when we're still not sure what to look for. Could sediment itself be memory? Not just what it covers, but what it contains. A chemical anomaly where something once burned. A magnetic shift from materials arranged in intentional patterns. A trace of ancient metallurgy buried under 2 miles of marine snow. Faint signals deep in the mud, beyond the reach of casual study. But there, patient, waiting, because the sea does not forget easily. It muffles, preserves. It holds its secrets in cool darkness for longer than stone. And if we believe that ancient people built near water, as we always have, then it follows that many of their traces are now beneath it. Not lost, just submerged, just quiet. So we dive. With submarines, with sonar, with samples raised from the ocean floor like offerings from another time. And as we read the layers, grain by grain, we start to hear it. Not a voice, but a pressure. Not a name, but a pattern. A story not written, but pressed into silence. And maybe, just maybe, we are not the first to try to understand what the ocean holds. Maybe others came before us, stood on shores that no longer exist, and wondered what would remain of them after the tide came in. Maybe they, too, imagined memory not as words on paper, but as weight in the deep. And if the ocean remembers not with clarity, but with care, how many lives might still be sleeping beneath its dark and watchful surface, cradled in the slow breath of falling silt? And yet, even in all that silence, beneath the weight of oceans, the hush of time, the soft forgetting of Earth itself, there's another question. One that turns the search inside out. What if the reason we find so little is not because nothing was there, but because everything was meant to disappear? What if the most advanced civilizations left behind the least? We picture progress as something loud, lasting. We think of steel, of towers, of machines heavy enough to scar the planet. We expect that intelligence will leave a mark, something indelible, etched deep into geology, a fossil of intention. But what if true advancement moves the other way, toward stillness, toward harmony, toward disappearance? What if the highest achievement was not to dominate the Earth, but to pass through it without a trace? Clean energy, biodegradable tools, architecture that dissolves with the seasons, technology that blooms, serves, and returns to soil like petals falling from a tree. No wires, no ruins, no waste, only use, only presence, only quiet. We look for clues in what survives. But what if they were too advanced to leave fossils? What if they lived in ways that never burdened the planet, that never altered its chemistry in ways we could now detect? No radioactive decay, no mass extinctions, no spikes in carbon, no plastic in the strata, just balance, just breath, just life woven so finely into the natural rhythm that it became indistinguishable from it. We would never see it. Not now, not in sediment, not in ruins. And perhaps that was the point, because permanence is not always the goal. In our world, we chase legacy. We fear being forgotten. But perhaps they didn't. Perhaps they knew that the most elegant presence is one that can end without echo. A culture built entirely on the principles of impermanence, of leaving no trace, of folding back into the earth like leaves at the end of a season. And if they existed, if they reached heights we cannot yet imagine, they may have passed through the world like wind, felt but never held. And what would that civilization look like? Not in its monuments, but in its absence. Maybe there is no anomaly, no carbon spike, no strange metals, no soot, just an unexpected stillness. A section of the geological record that seems too clean, too unbroken, too unscarred for the age it belongs to. We wouldn't think to question it. We'd call it a quiet time, a lull in history, a gap between dramas. But maybe it wasn't a gap. Maybe it was their moment. A long chapter of flourishing so perfectly balanced that the planet never needed to remember it. Because there was nothing to grieve. No catastrophe. No trauma. Just a rising, a living, a dissolving. We imagine fossils as the memory of life. But maybe the truest lives are the ones that leave no fossils at all. We imagine progress as a structure. But maybe the most sophisticated structures leave no debris. No broken skeletons. No accidental artifacts. Just dust. Just silence. Just the continuing flow of Earth being Earth. And so, we search the layers expecting to find them. But they will not be found. Not in the way we're used to. Because the anti-fossil is not what remains. It is what is missing. It is the hollow space where something should have scarred the planet but didn't. It is the stillness that feels too precise. It is the part of the story where the page is blank. Not because it was never written, but because it was written to vanish. And if such a people once lived, if they learned how to be here without leaving fingerprints, how would we ever know that we were not the first to dream of leaving nothing behind? And if nothing is left, no bones, no tools, no ash, does that mean nothing was there? Or could absence itself have weight? Because some things shape us not by their presence, but by the space they leave behind. Like gravity, invisible, felt, but not seen, measured not in light, but in curve. Planets bend space around them. Stars pull on what they cannot touch. And black holes, the ultimate in forgotten matter, move galaxies with their silence. What if history works the same way? What if the civilizations we've lost aren't gone entirely, but still tug on the paths we walk, the questions we ask, the instincts we follow without us knowing why? Maybe the echoes we chase aren't just in the strata, but in us. Maybe we are shaped by what came before, even if we can't remember it. Especially if we can't remember it. What if the myths we carry, the floods, the towers, the golden ages, aren't just metaphors, but gravitational memories, bending our stories around truths long since erased? We find ourselves drawn to certain places, certain shapes, certain dreams we keep dreaming generation after generation. Why do we build cities beside rivers? Why do we reach for the stars? Why do we search the past with such quiet urgency, as if looking for something we can't name, but miss all the same? Could it be that we're circling the gravity of something we've forgotten? A civilization so distant that even its ruins have returned to dust, but its pull remains. In our curiosity, in our longing, in the strange alignments between cultures that never touched, but rhyme in their rituals, their symbols, their sense of the sacred. We think of lost civilizations as hidden beneath us, but maybe they are around us, curving our view, shaping what we see without ever appearing themselves. Just like dark matter, invisible yet essential, the scaffolding upon which galaxies cling, undetectable by light, but undeniable in effect. What if forgotten history works like that? What if erasure is not an end, but a new kind of presence? One we don't see because we're inside it, moved by it, living in its softened wake. We don't know how many times the page has turned, how many versions of civilization rose and fell before ink and stone began to keep track. But if some left no mark, no fossil, no monument, that doesn't mean they left nothing at all. They may have left shape, pull, a gravitational story still folding space and thought around itself, quietly bending what we build, what we dream, what we assume to be new. Because forgetting is never clean. It leaves contours. It leaves scars too subtle for maps but felt in the way we move, the questions we keep asking. Like, are we alone? Were we first? Is something missing? Maybe the gravity of forgotten things is what keeps those questions alive. Maybe it keeps us looking down and up and back. And maybe that's the legacy of what's been lost, to shape the present without ever showing its face. And if the weight of the forgotten can curve our path this much, how many unseen histories are we still orbiting, without knowing their names? And if we are still circling them, in thought, in instinct, in curiosity we can't explain, then a slower question begins to rise. A question not of stone or science, but of self. Who are we if we are not the first? We like to think of ourselves as the beginning, the origin point, the makers of meaning, the first to dream, to map, to climb the ladder of stars. We write history as if it starts with us, with our memory, our language, our tools. But what if the line does not begin here? What if we are not the first chapter, but one written deeper in the book? Not a preface, but a continuation. Not a lone voice, but an echo. And if we are the echo, what does that make us? We think of echoes as fainter, less real. But an echo is still a voice, still a sound with shape, still a part of something. Maybe we are the reverberation of a pattern that has come before. Civilization as rhythm, memory as tide, culture as breath, in and out, rise and fall. We build because it's what we know to do. But what if we know it because it has already been done? What if invention is remembering? What if every tool, every question, every hunger for understanding is a chord that has already been struck, a song sung once before in a tongue now dissolved? Then we are not the first, but we are not less for it. We are part of something wider, older, a lineage of minds stretching across time. Though broken, though blurred, we may not carry their names. We may never find their bones. But if we carry the shape of their wonder, their fear, their hope, then something survives. And maybe being new is not about being first. Maybe it's about becoming aware of the cycle we're in. New not because we are alone, but because we're starting to listen, to ask the soft questions, to feel the gravity of forgotten things, to wonder if we, too, will one day be invisible, but still shaping the lives to come. What does it mean to be modern if modernity is only a season? What does it mean to be advanced if advancement is a thread others once held and let go? Maybe it means we're walking a familiar path wearing different shoes. Maybe it means we're part of Earth's memory now, a memory that stretches not upward, but inward. And maybe identity, in the deepest sense, is not about what we've built, but how we remember. Not what we claim, but how gently we ask. Have others stood here before us? And if they did, what would they see in us now? Would they recognize our rhythm? Would they see our machines and remember their own? Would they smile at our insistence that we are the first to map the stars? Or would they, too, be lost in the same slow question, wondering if they were alone, wondering what it meant to begin? Maybe the greatest humility is knowing we may not be the original. And maybe the greatest honor is carrying forward the light of those we can no longer see. And if we are not the first, if we are not the only, then what kind of future might we shape, now that we know we are not the beginning but the continuation of a question still being asked? And perhaps the clearest answer to that question comes not from the past, but from the future. Because one day we too will vanish. The world we know, the world we've built, it will not last forever. Our towers will crack. Our satellites will fall. Our language, our scripts, our names carved into data centers and marble facades will all erode into anonymity. Even plastic, that stubborn symbol of our age, will soften in time. Crushed, abraded, digested by bacteria we did not yet imagine. What we once believed was immortal will begin to surrender. Skyscrapers will rust into landscape. Roads will break into root and rubble. Silicon will lose its order. Iron will return to red dust. And the earth will go on. Not in mourning, not in anger, but in continuity. Oceans will breathe again, untroubled. Mountains will crumble as they always do. Forests will regrow in the skeletons of our cities. And somewhere, sometime, someone may walk across the bones of what we once called the future. And they might wonder, were we the first? They may not know our names. They may never find our books, or our satellites drifting cold through starless space. They may never know that we worried about our memory, that we feared being forgotten even as we tried to hold on to everything. But perhaps they will find a fragment, a patch of strange soil, a chemical signature out of place, a pattern etched into the shape of erosion. And they will feel the familiar pull, the gravity of forgotten things. They will ask, who were they? What did they dream of? Why did they vanish? And that moment, that soft, wondering moment, will make us real again. Not in form, not in name, but in presence, in the rhythm of civilization rising and falling, like breath. We are not immune to that rhythm. We are part of it. We think we are too modern, too global, too interconnected to fall into silence. But so may have others. So may have every great culture that once believed it had outrun the cycle. And still the forests returned. The winds scattered memory. The oceans covered the rest. We believe we are different because we can see stars, because we can send our thoughts across the planet in a blink. But the stars do not remember us. And blinking wires, like everything else, will fray. What then of us? Who will we become once our time here has finished its turning? Maybe that is not a tragedy. Maybe it is a gift, to be part of the Earth's long story, to be one of its verses, sung briefly and then let go. We have left echoes, yes. Plastic, glass, faint radiation, technofossils scattered in sediment. But these are only footprints. They are not the whole of us. What if our real trace is softer still? What if it is in the way we looked at the sky, the way we loved, the way we asked where did we come from? Maybe the mark we leave will not be found in steel, but in curiosity itself. Passed forward, hand to hand, heart to mind. Across generations we'll never meet. And maybe that's enough. To be a breath in the long wind of Earth's memory. To be a question posed in stone, answered in dust. Because one day, even if no one remembers our words, someone may feel them. In the way their hands hesitate over strange soil. In the awe they feel staring at ruins with no story. In the silence that follows when they realize they may not be the first. And so, if we are to vanish, and we will, let it be gently. Let it be honestly. Let it be with the grace of knowing we were part of something vast. Not the beginning, not the end. Just one voice, in the long, echoing memory of the planet that carries us. And if someone asks one day, beneath a future sky, if we were ever here, may the Earth answer softly, yes, they dreamed.